Welcome to Talk to Al Jazeera. I'm Mark Seddon and I've come to historic St Andrews in Scotland to talk with Hans Blix, former Swedish Foreign Minister, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and of course more recently in charge of the United Nations Weapons Inspections teams inside Iraq. Hans Blix, thank you very much for joining us. It's 5 years now since the beginning of the Iraq War, the 5th anniversary. Have you any major regrets?
As to what we did, no. I cannot think of anything that we would have done differently. We had a mandate from the Security Council. We didn't have a mandate from the United States or from the UK. It was the whole Security Council. We were international civil servants. We were asked to verify with professionalism whether there were any weapons of mass destruction and try to clarify the many question marks, the unaccounted for items which existed from the past. Were they real? Did they exist or not? Mr. Wolfowitz, for instance, would say in the Security Council and elsewhere that these are unaccounted for. Where are they? Well, if things are unaccounted for, it may exist or it may not exist. So I think it was a basic logical error. But what we did was professional. We had professional people, and no one has criticized, not the Americans, nor anybody else, for our professionalism in the work.
And looking back, is there anything you think that you could have done just to help stop that juggernaut to war? Anything that you really wanted that you couldn't really do, that you felt could have made a difference?
Well, some people have criticized us after the war for not saying in March 2003, there are no weapons of mass destruction, because what we said is that we have carried out 700 inspections of 500 different sites. We have been to several dozen sites given to us by intelligence that they suspect, and we have not found anything. But you see, a problem is that you prove the negative is not possible. To prove that nothing exists anywhere in Iraq, you couldn't do it. And therefore, if we had said that, we would have been tackled. Can you be sure that there's nothing up in this mountain here and there? You cannot say that. But we had come very far after all. And I think that the fact that the majority of the General Assembly and the majority of the Security Council, they wanted more inspections. That was a result of our reports to the Security Council.
Now, I think you were actually retired at the time, and the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan, called you out of retirement. He asked you to come and run UNMAVIC and head the weapons inspectors in Iraq. I mean, did you have any idea of the task that lay ahead for you and your team?
No, not as to the drama. We did not. I had the idea that we could carry out inspections in a manner that would be more productive than they had been in the 90s. Because I think that in the 90s, you know, they remember that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis, they stopped the inspectors many times. And we all believed then that if they stopped them, it must be because they have something to hide. Well, they didn't have anything to hide. And we have asked ourselves afterwards, why did they stop them then, if there's nothing to hide? And the theory, one theory I have is what I call the beware of the dog theory. That's to say that you can put a sign on your door saying beware of the dog without having a dog. He wanted to tell his neighbors that I'm still dangerous. He didn't mind the suspicion that he had something. At the same time, he wanted to say to the United Nations that I have nothing and you should lift the sanctions. So getting back to the inspectors, I think in the 90s then it was a misunderstanding. A wrong conclusion that we drew that he had something. And there must have been other reasons then why they stopped the inspectors. And I think that there were several. One was that there were intelligence people among the inspectors from the US and from the UK. And these intelligence people, the Iraqis knew, could report on what they saw, military installations that could the next day be targets. Well, that was not something that would make them more welcoming in the inspectors. Another one was that I think the inspectors sometimes behaved a bit like Rambos. And when I took over the inspections in 2000, one of the things I said was that we are going there to exercise all the rights we have, and effectively, like a police. However, we are not going there to harass, to provoke, or to humiliate the Iraqis. And our relations were not easy with the Iraqis, I'm not saying that, but they were correct. And they never stopped us. And no inspections did they stop us. So I think that the correctness in this, behaving like international civil servants or national inspectors, I think that paid off.
I mean, prior to you heading the weapons inspectors teams and getting inside Iraq, there was something of a row about your appointment. I recollect Vice President Cheney was one of those objectors. Now, what was it, even at that stage, that had certain individuals, such as Vice President Cheney in the US administration, objecting to you?
Well, Cheney could not have made an objection because I was appointed in year 2000. That was still during the Clinton administration. Madeleine Albright phoned me personally and thanked me. And I know that the US administration was in favor of hanging me. Now, it's true, you are quite right in saying that Cheney was highly critical of inspections. And I think on one occasion he said that inspectors are useless at best. And he wanted the US to go ahead with an invasion and not having the complication. He saw that inspections could be complications. Suppose these guys come up and say there is nothing. That would be a complication for the United States. And maybe Blair had some influence there, because Blair was of the view that there should be inspections and that they must go back to the UN, and that if Saddam does not comply with the UN, then he might have seen a casus belli in that. So Blair in the UK played a role in pushing for it. So did Colin Powell, and so did some other people. And Cheney then had to back out. But you are quite right in saying that Cheney and Rumsfeld, also Rumsfeld, I think, were totally against the idea.
Now, at that 11th hour, when I think the Allied forces amounted to about 50-odd thousand across the border of Iraq, the crisis was fast approaching. It appeared to assist you in your campaign to pressurize the regime to come clean, to have this force not acting. Throughout, of course, you asked for more time, and that was also the demand of many others, not just you, but people within the United Nations, many other governments as well. Do you think, had you had a bit more time, you could have got to that truth? And if so, Dr. Blix, how much time did you think you really needed?
I think 2 months more would have made a difference. You see, we had many sites given to us by intelligence, by American and British and others. And we went to these sites. And when the invasion took place, we had been to about 3 dozens of the sites. And since there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, we reported that to the intelligence, who had given us the ideas, and also to the Security Council. Now, if we had had 2 months more, I think we would have been able to go to all the sites given to us by intelligence, and they would have been empty, and we had reported that. And the intelligence would have had to draw the conclusion that their sources were bad. I mean, in most cases, their sources were defectors. Defectors were interested in invasion and not in inspection. And they have admitted since then that they also actually fooled the recipients on the US side. I mean, I can blame the defectors, but I can also blame the US for accepting this. They wanted to accept it, but intelligence there are professional. They must also be very skeptical about what they get, and they were not. We, fortunately, were not recipient of information from the inspectors. We had our people on the ground, so we had a much better reality to report. But the fact is that if we had had 2 months more, I think it would have been much more difficult to launch the inspection. I think Saddam would have remained, and that would have been a sad result. He would have continued to oppress his people. I think the likelihood is that he would have developed like a Castro or like a Gaddafi, an oppressor of his own country, but not really a danger to anybody else.
I mean, you talked about the factors behind the Allied invasion of Iraq. One factor you've raised is 9/11 and its aftermath, the political resolve of the Bush administration to go after what they saw were America's enemies, aided, as you said, by some of the defectors. The question for an awful lot of people all over the world, and also in America, it's often a question on the lips, is what was the motivation for Prime Minister Tony Blair to go along with it?
I think that he hoped that the UK could influence the United States in the special relation. Maybe he also hoped that he could build a bridge between Europe, to which the UK belongs, and the Anglo-Saxon world. And I think he had a limited influence. I think, for instance, that the sending of the inspectors, demand of the inspectors in the US administration going along with that was very likely pushed by Blair and made an impact on the Americans. But he was not alone. I'm sure that Colin Powell also wanted to go that way. And at the end of the game in March, Blair and the UK policy was still trying to go for action in the Security Council. They they suggested a scheme under which the Iraqis would do sort of pay down. Say they take 10 of the most important undersold issues. Can you solve this within a month? Well, then we'll go on to another 10 and so forth. This was a scheme, but the Germans and the French and the Russians, I don't think had confidence any longer. They felt that they would be trapped, and that they would be trapped into a sort of authorization of the war, and they didn't want to do that. So the British had a different line. Eventually they were forced to accept the legal reasoning of the Americans, and that was the reasoning that prior resolutions gave them a permission slip to go in. I think it's a pretty weak theory, but they have to throw out something at any rate.
If it is the case that leading politicians were told that this could be an illegal war and that information was being massaged in order to win votes in parliaments, do you think that that some people who have argued that politicians such as Bush and Blair should actually eventually face charges in the international court is a valid claim to make?
Well, I understand the people who do it. I mean, I have never said that they were in bad faith. I think to say that you need to have very strong evidence to do so. But I think there was bad judgment. Politicians at that level, I think, should exercise a critical judgment on what they see. They did not want to do that. They wanted to have a confirmation of their suspicion and the political action that they were to take. And I think that certainly can then be severely criticized. But you must also realize that Bush was re-elected after this, and Blair also had the parliamentary support. So it's not exclusively the leader. But my feeling is that they misled themselves first, and then they misled the people. And this is terrible. You know, if we sentence somebody to death, we think that there should be very solid evidence before you do that and before you execute. Now, can we go ahead sentencing a whole country to invasion and to war with thousands and thousands of people killed on thin or no evidence at all? That's an unpleasant question.